$12 of ground beef turned into 3 completely different family dinners in my kitchen this week, and this isn't some thin stretch it with rice trick that leaves everybody still hungry an hour later. It's a method I learned from watching ranch wives feed working families for generations. On 1 pound of ground beef, split 3 ways, each dinner built to taste like its own separate meal, rather than the same thing served 3 nights in a row with a different sauce dumped on top. By the end of this, you'll know the exact way to portion and prep that 1 pound so it stretches properly, the 3 actual dinners built from it, and the mistake that turns a smart stretching method into exactly the boring, repetitive week people assume cooking this way has to be. Let's start with the core idea, because this only works if you understand what's actually happening to that pound of beef before it ever splits into 3 directions. 1 pound of ground beef, cooked and seasoned as a completely neutral base first, before any dish-specific flavor gets added, is what makes this method work. Most people cook ground beef already seasoned for whatever single dish they're making that night, taco seasoning mixed in while it browns, or Italian seasoning worked in from the start, which locks that pound into exactly one direction before it's even finished cooking. Cooking it plain first, just browned with salt and pepper and nothing dish-specific, keeps it flexible enough to become 3 different meals instead of 1 meal you're just eating 3 nights running. Let's talk about the actual browning and portioning, because this first step is what everything else depends on. Brown your full pound in a large skillet, breaking it into small, even crumbles, rather than large chunks, since smaller pieces distribute more evenly once you're splitting it into 3 separate portions and building 3 separate flavor directions around it. Season simply while it browns, just salt, pepper, and a bit of garlic powder, if you want a neutral aromatic base that won't clash with any of the 3 directions you're about to take it. Drain off excess fat once it's fully browned, since carrying extra grease into 3 separate dishes concentrates fat you don't need in any of them. Once it's browned and drained, divide that pound into 3 roughly equal portions, somewhere around 5 to 6 ounces each depending on how much fat cooked out. 5 to 6 ounces of beef doesn't sound like much for a family dinner on its own, and that's exactly the point. Each portion is meant to be the protein anchor of a dish, built out with other inexpensive ingredients around it, not the entire meal by itself the way a full pound would be if you just made 1 big batch of something and ate it 3 nights straight. Let's get into the first dinner, because this is where that neutral base starts taking its first real direction. Dinner 1 is a Tex-Mex skillet, built around that first 5 to 6 ounce portion. Into the same pan, add a can of diced tomatoes with green chilies, a can of black beans drained, and a cup of rice, either already cooked or added raw with enough broth or water to cook through in the pan depending on how much time you've got that particular night. Season with cumin, chili powder, and a bit more garlic powder. Simmer until the rice is tender and everything's come together into one cohesive skillet, and top with whatever cheese you've got on hand. That's dinner 1, built from roughly 1/3 of your original pound, plus a handful of pantry staples that together cost considerably less than the beef itself did. Dinner 2 takes a completely different direction, built around Italian flavors instead, using the second portion of that same browned beef. A jar of marinara, or a simple can of crushed tomatoes seasoned with Italian herbs, a bit of onion and garlic cooked down first if you've got a few extra minutes, and that second portion of beef stirred through until it's heated back through and the sauce has thickened slightly. Serve over pasta, and this reads as a completely separate meal from the Tex-Mex skillet 2 nights earlier, even though the actual protein at the center of both dishes came from the exact same pound of beef browned in the exact same pan on the same day. The third dinner goes in yet another direction, built around a simple, hearty vegetable soup base using the final portion. Beef broth as your liquid base, a bag of frozen mixed vegetables or whatever's cheapest that week, a can of diced tomatoes, and that last portion of beef stirred in to simmer together for 20 to 30 minutes until the vegetables are tender and the flavors have melded. Season with a bit of Worcestershire sauce and black pepper, And you've got a genuinely warming, substantial soup that reads nothing like either of the first two meals, despite sharing that same original pound of beef as its protein foundation. Let's talk about why splitting the cooking this way actually works from a flavor standpoint, because understanding the mechanism is what lets you build your own 3 directions instead of just following these exact 3 forever. Ground beef itself carries a relatively neutral, adaptable flavor on its own, especially once it's just browned with basic seasoning rather than committed to a specific direction from the start. The actual identity of a dish, whether it reads as Tex-Mex, Italian, or a hearty soup, comes almost entirely from what you build around that protein rather than from the protein itself. Cumin and chili powder and black beans read as Tex-Mex, regardless of what protein's sitting underneath them. Marinara and Italian herbs read as Italian the same way. That's the actual insight ranch wives were working from generations before anyone called this a meal prep hack online. The protein is a blank foundation, and the seasoning and supporting ingredients around it are doing almost all of the work of making each meal feel genuinely distinct. Let's talk about the actual math here, because seeing the cost breakdown side by side is what makes this method worth the extra planning, compared to just buying protein separately for 3 different meals across the week. A pound of ground beef running around $6 at a typical grocery store, split into 3 portions, means you're spending roughly $2 of protein per meal, considerably less than buying a fresh pound of beef, chicken, or any other protein 3 separate times for 3 separate dinners. The remaining cost across all 3 meals comes from pantry staples, canned beans, canned tomatoes, rice, pasta, frozen vegetables, broth, all of which run cheap individually and cheaper still when you're not also buying a full pound of fresh protein for each individual dish. $12 total across all 3 dinners, protein and supporting ingredients combined, is a realistic number for a family of 4 eating genuinely different meals across 3 separate nights, which is a considerably better outcome than the same $12 spent trying to buy 3 separate proteins for 3 separate dinners individually. Let's talk about timing this across an actual week, because the real value of this method shows up in how it fits into a working family's schedule, rather than just in the raw cost savings alone. Brown the full pound once, on whatever day you've got a spare 15 minutes. Portion it into 3 separate containers and refrigerate what you're not using that same night. Properly stored in sealed containers, browned ground beef holds well in the refrigerator for 3 to 4 days, which comfortably covers building all 3 dinners across the same week without any portions sitting long enough to raise a food safety concern. This front-loads the most time-consuming single step, browning and draining a full pound of beef, into one session rather than repeating it 3 separate times across 3 separate nights, which is exactly where a lot of the actual time savings comes from beyond just the money. Let's cover the mistakes now, because these are the ones that turn this method into exactly the repetitive, boring week people assume stretching 1 pound of beef 3 ways has to produce. The first mistake is seasoning the beef for one specific dish while it's still browning, before you've split it into portions. That locks the entire pound into one flavor direction before you've even decided what the other 2 dinners are going to be, and it's exactly why a lot of home attempts at stretching ground beef across a weekend up tasting like the same dish reheated with different sides, rather than 3 genuinely distinct meals. The second mistake is choosing 3 directions that overlap too much in flavor profile, like building all 3 around a similar tomato and Italian herb base, with only minor variations between them. Genuinely different cuisines or flavor families, the way Tex-Mex, Italian, and a hearty vegetable soup diverge from each other, is what actually makes this feel like 3 separate dinners rather than one dinner with 3 different names attached to it. The third mistake is not draining the beef properly after browning, carrying extra grease into all 3 dishes rather than starting each one from a clean, well-drained base. That extra fat compounds across 3 separate meals in a way that makes each dish taste heavier and less balanced than it should, especially in a soup base where excess grease pools visibly on the surface. The fourth mistake is skipping the individual portioning and storage step, keeping the full browned pound together and just scooping roughly a third out each time you cook. That approach makes it far too easy to accidentally use more than a third in the first meal, leaving the third dinner shortchanged on protein by the time you get to it later in the week. A few questions people ask me regularly once they've tried this method themselves. What if you want to stretch this further for a bigger family using more than 1 pound of beef total? The same principle scales up linearly. 2 pounds browned and split into 3 larger portions, instead of 1 pound into 3 smaller ones, still giving you 3 separate dinners just built with more protein per portion for a bigger household. What if you don't like one of the 3 specific directions I walk through here? Swap it for whatever cuisine or flavor direction your own family actually enjoys, since the underlying method, a neutral browned base, split 3 ways into genuinely different flavor families, works with nearly any combination you choose rather than being locked into Tex-Mex, Italian, and soup specifically. What if you're not going to cook all 3 dinners within the same week and need this to last longer? Freeze the portions you're not using within that 3 to 4 day refrigerator window instead of letting them sit, and properly frozen browned beef holds well for a couple of months, which lets you spread these 3 dinners across separate weeks, rather than needing to commit to all 3 happening back to back. What if you want to add more vegetables or bulk to stretch each individual dinner even further than the base recipes I described? All 3 directions handle extra vegetables well without disrupting the core flavor profile. More bell pepper and onion in the Tex-Mex skillet. More zucchini or spinach worked into the Italian sauce. More of whatever frozen vegetable blend you've got in the soup, since vegetables are cheap enough that padding out any of these 3 further barely moves the total cost while stretching the finished portions even more. That's genuinely the whole method, start to finish, questions included. 1 pound of ground beef, browned plain and drained well, split into 3 roughly equal portions. 3 genuinely different flavor directions built around each portion instead of 1 repeated dish with minor variations. Front-loaded prep that saves real time across the week, not just money. $12, 3 dinners, and a family that has no idea all 3 nights, traced back to the exact same pound of beef browned in the exact same pan on the exact same afternoon. Brown your pound this week, split it 3 ways, and build 3 dinners your family will genuinely think came from 3 separate trips to the store.